All right, welcome back to Track B, Room B. So I'm Joanne, I'm your moderator for this room. So we have 3 papers in the panel, and we'll stick to time, just as a reminder, 15 minutes presentation, whenever you're ready.
Is this okay? You can see my screen?
Yes, I'm good to go.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Yeah, thanks everybody. I'm looking forward to this discussion here. I'm Aparna Katre from the University of Minnesota in Duluth. And today I want to talk about a conceptual study exploring the potential of self-directed learning amongst craftspeople to become entrepreneurs. And just by way of context, I teach cultural entrepreneurship at the university here. And my research interests are in social cultural entrepreneurship with a focus on sustainable development per se. So this is a conceptual study, like I said, and oops, sorry, I need to be on my screen here to advance the slides. Okay, yep. So the primary motivations of my study, if I look at it, we all know that the creative economy is kind of, a growing sector overall, and it has grown. The crafts sector within the creative economy has grown at more than 4% between 2003 2015, and it's pretty significant size in terms of it's about 35 billion overall in terms of the trade that has happened. So another thing about crafts economy is that it has a potential for livelihoods and promoting cultural diversity and inclusivity because of the nature of crafts that come in and rooted in traditions and sort of heritage. So when I look at the creative economy and we look at the notion of legacy cities, and I'll define that a little later in my talk here, but if you look at post-industrial kinds of cities, even in the United States, by some count, even the smaller cities, there are more than 400 such cities in the US. And industrial crafts have been around for some time. And, examples of these are obviously the bigger ones are like Chicago, Detroit, and then you have Cleveland, and you have more smaller legacy towns like Akron in Ohio and Duluth in Minnesota, where I am here. And in these places, some of these places, we are seeing sort of increasing examples of crafts entrepreneurship coming in. However, the smaller of the legacy cities have less resources. And, historically, they haven't had as many incubators, certainly not crafts-related incubators or accelerators. They have very little access to sort of formal entrepreneurship education that might happen to artisans and, investments, so on and so forth. So they're kind of resource strapped, but yet there is potential over here. So that's why I'm interested in studying this topic, and the phenomena of, interest that I have here is how do artisans and, craftspeople in these small legacy cities, how do they actually get onto I'm calling it the runway to entrepreneurship. I'm not as much interested in once they become entrepreneurs and how do they, grow their businesses and scale. But really it's about how do they go from being an artisan person who practices craft to actually being entrepreneurial. And in there, what I'm really interested in looking at then is crafts products tend to be more project-based. So the notion of product market fit, how does that happen? And how do they even create a market for their products? And because these are artisans by nature, how do they acquire basic business skills? So those are the kinds of issues I'm looking at here. So before I go further, I just want to get some definitions here so that, we're all talking about the same things. As far as crafts is concerned, for this discussion and this paper, I'm really using the UNESCO's and UNCTAD framework of, it's basically something that artisans make. A significant portion of what they make is contribution by the artisan itself. So they could be using some tools, but it's really artisan driven in this process. Definition of legacy cities, these are basically towns that used to be sort of thriving economic places at some point, and had kind of the infrastructure of thriving towns in the peak of the industrial era, but then have since declined in their population and sustained the population loss for a long time. And in here, those towns that have population of about like 15,000 to 150,000 are called smaller legacy cities. And those are the ones that are kind of resource strapped that I talked about early on. And that's kind of the focus of what I want to look at here. The self-directed learning, there are many learning theories, entrepreneurial learning theories. I'm looking at self-directed learning, and a process view of self-directed learning says that, it's the process where individuals take responsibility for, setting goals, planning, carrying out the learning actions, and evaluating the learning experiences altogether. So it's totally ownership is with the learner itself. And a second definition that expands it to include kind of the outcomes of learning, to involve sort of the knowledge, skills gained in this process. So why self-directed learning amongst all our theories of learning that might exist? One that, our craftspeople and artisans actually, whether they do this for hobby or for profession, essentially you're constantly learning how to improve your craft, most often by yourselves. So there might be an inherent kind of benefit that mindset might bring to the table in terms of, acquiring even entrepreneurial skills. So that's why I'm looking at this. And more often than not, these people have taken responsibility for their own learning and have figured out how to overcome challenges in excelling in their craft, right? So dealing with adversities, they might have some experience in here, and therefore might be a reason to explore this learning theory. So a little bit about self-directed learning, and then I'll get to what I've done here. Self-directed learning is one of the learning theories that is constructivist in nature, where learners, construct meaning from their experiences. And at the same time, the purpose of their learning here is to actually construct a reality. So it's both ways. And I think the key thing here is that self-directed learning is not like planned, and neither is it linear in nature. It's sort of the interaction that happens between the learner's environment, learner's motivations, actions, and abilities. All these interact to create what are called as learning episodes. So therefore, it's kind of nonlinear and unplanned in many ways. If you look at the main dimensions of self-directed learning, it's basically self-directed learning emphasizes the notion of exercising self-control, what you see on the right-hand side. And it is essentially you exercise control to acquire knowledge and skills, to challenge yourself, to get better at, whatever you're learning, control in terms of managing your time and resources. And on the other hand, there's also responsibility. So there's self-monitoring in terms of, understanding what you're actually learning. So gathering evidence of what you've learned, evidence of, evaluating the evidence to know what learning actually happened. And that requires some amount of sort of reflective thinking critically on part of the learner. So there's some responsibility and there's some control. But both of these assume or require motivation for the task. And it's not just sort of, motivation to begin something, but actually sustained motivation. And that's in the form of motivation to set goals, arranging for feedback and, assessing what came out, and of course, celebrating the achievements that come to then reinforce and, sustain the motivation. So that's kind of sort of the main dimensions of self-directed learning. A couple other things in terms of habits. Self-directed learning requires the habits of both thinking and action, as well as observing and analyzing. If you go to self-directed learning and entrepreneurship, there are really only handful of studies that have looked at self-directed learning amongst entrepreneurs, and that's largely in the context of exploring the readiness for self-directed learning, and looking at the cultural context, country context, and looking at self-directed readiness of entrepreneurs at a macro level. It really hasn't been explored in great depth in terms of the behaviors and actions and how it might be happening on the ground. So it's kind of open slate and a good way to really look at it. Of course, this is to the best of my knowledge and as much as I've explored the research so far. So what have I done in this? As I said, the study is conceptual in nature in many ways, because really the field is quite open, and you have to kind of play around a little bit with the idea to see how it fits, and then direct more empirical work in the field. So what I'm really interested in exploring, like I said, it's the early stages, product market fit, how do they develop their customers early stage, and how do they acquire early business skills, especially when they come from a very strong background of making some kind of craft. My study, I'm in Duluth, Minnesota, a small legacy town, so perfect site for me to collect some data and explore in detail what is happening through deep interviews. And I'm talking about here as I present what I find. I'm looked at 4 entrepreneurs from this town in the field of making tattoo, making jewelry, fashion, craft brewing, coffee roasting kinds that involves handwork. So what did I find in speaking with these entrepreneurs, and what are they in terms of self-directed learning? I think the key thing here is an interesting feature that kind of stood out consistently for me is that, of course, the sample that I had, none of them had actually studied the craft in school. They were not like, studio arts or ceramic arts kind of majors in school, and they had studied something completely different. So for them, this craft was really a hobby and a passion. And they had initially, most of them had no ambitions of becoming an entrepreneur, but really what they were doing is they were playing with the craft. So I saw them engaging in these playful cycles of making something, but then sharing it with others, listening to feedback from others, learning from what people are saying. And, because people are expressing what they want, that motivated them to do more and try something different and keep changing. So there were many such playful cycles that were in there, because there wasn't like a stated business goal around it. The notion of, they described cases where they failed and they made mistakes, and it was really fun. It wasn't like, oh, now I'm falling flat in my face kind of thing. So those cycles were very, very evident. And, in this process, the artisans, craft people, they were the ones who were deciding what do they make, who do they share it with, how do they listen to the feedback, which ones do they act on, which ones they don't act on. So all these decisions were made by the entrepreneurs themselves. I need to speed up. And I think in this process, what they were doing is they were growing the base of patrons. I call them patrons in the beginning because they were really not like customers. They were people who liked the craft, who enjoyed the craft, were giving feedback. And at some point, because this was so repetitive, there was some money that was charged and pricing for the product that happened, but not really like any other formal business pricing that would happen. But that gave them some exposure in the beginning to start acquiring basic knowledge about, how this works in terms of inventory and how much should I carry, and product pricing, and so on and so forth. These cyclical sort of, learning cycles that happen, at some point they realize that there is a market potential over here, and that's when they get more serious in their learning process, and it became a turning point in what they did. So getting into commercialization, this is when serious business learning also started coming in, particularly for marketing, operations, and financing. And of course, with resources, it was all again self-directed. They reached out to mentors, networks, SBDC locally to get some knowledge, but it was all about, I need this, I need to go learn this and acquire those skills. So you see that kind of, practice that came about. Okay. So then, in terms of, what does this mean from the perspective of, what do we do with this that we have found here? And I think from a practice perspective, in the context of legacy cities that we have, artisans clearly seems like they do have an advantage of this notion of playful cycles, and those can be extended to, getting them on a trajectory to pursuing entrepreneurship. Initially, it starts with just excelling at your craft and making craft that people like, but that presents an advantage. And all of this is happening in non-academic, non-classroom settings for artisans and craft people. So clearly, if we talk about some interventions that focus on helping artisans develop their self-directed learning capabilities, that can be an advantage. In terms of research, this is only conceptual. So clearly, We can look at there's a well-developed, self-directed learning readiness scale. We can use that and explore and say, do craftspeople, are they better suited for it or not? How does that happen? And then, how does that influence? Do those artisans who are higher on the scale of self-directed learning readiness, do they perform better than others or not? So we can really get into more empirical studies in this space as a starting point. For just one note, for those of you who may have read my paper, I'm in the middle of making major revisions, and I've kind of really cut down on what I had originally over there. And that's why you hear limited scope of what I'm talking here. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna. Any questions or comments from the group? I'll start with one, and then anybody else jump in. Was there an implicit assumption among these crafts workers that entrepreneurship was the ultimate goal? Go ahead.
Actually, no. Only maybe one somewhere along the way. But, three of them did not have that early on. When they were really playing with the craft, they did not. In fact, one was like, doing it as a side hustle for a long time, just in terms of passion, and was forced to jump into entrepreneurship at some point, and was really confident making the craft that, it was an easy transition later on. But when they were really making the craft, no, it wasn't.
Yeah, I throughout your presentation, I was just wondering about the sample population, the sample that you're looking at, and what are their kind of inherent motivations? Do they even want to get to the point where they start their own business, which I assume is how you defined entrepreneurship. Is that right?
Right. Those who want to, yeah.
Yeah, because it's an interesting population in and of itself. You can look at other types of, I think, artistic disciplines and maybe make that implicit assumption a little bit easier. But among craftspeople, I don't even know whether or not that would be something that they would, many craftspeople would be even focused on achieving near the end. So,
right, yeah.
Any other questions or comments for Aparna before we go to the next paper? We'll also have opportunity to discuss at the end, of course. Yes, does Duluth have a very large craftsperson population?
Yeah, actually they do. There's a crafts corridor that's come up, in the last several years, and it's all based on industrial kind of using the industrial history of the region and using that to turn into really handmade, very, very strong crafts corridor. Lincoln Park Craft District, a full segment is named after that.
I mean, I was thinking actually Bloomington would be a wonderful place for you to do a little bit of work as well, because we have a lot of actually craftspeople who then have opened their own business and are pretty prominent in Bloomington just for, and, have been here for a long, long time. So.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And that's why legacy cities, there are like 400 legacy cities in the US.
Oh, really?
So, yes. I mean, there's data on that. And, that's kind of the thing that sits between the larger cities and rural areas. So they don't get the attention and resources that are needed. And therefore they form a very unique kind of, group.
Yeah, I mean, I really love this line of study because honestly, there's been so much in other areas when we think about design thinking and the processes, right? Artists in general are taking, in order to kind of go from product to market. And it's, this seems to me like a very tangible trajectory, at least to observe among this particular group of people. So I love that. I like that you decided to narrow in on that, especially. Any final comments or questions for Aparna before we move on? Okay, well, if you have them, save them till the end and we will continue later on. So I see, great, Olaf. I'm going to go ahead and give you co-host status here so you can share your screen. All right, one second. All right, you should be able to go ahead and share your screen. So we have our second paper.
Okay, let me just see here. This is all new to me. This.
Great.
And then I need to start the slideshow. Does that work now?
Oh, we see presenters view. Maybe just go up to the use slideshow option at the top there. Play from current slide, maybe try that. I don't know why we have that.
Okay.
Can you, right above you, use slideshow? Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Does that work now?
We see your presenter's view, but it's not really a big deal. So I would say just go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all. And my apologies that I'm jumping on a little bit late here. I had some technical difficulties joining. We're running multiple Zoom lines here at home today, and I've had some connectivity issues. So the one thing that I want to share with you today is a project that I've been working on for the last year and a half now that is focused on co-designing community-based entrepreneurship education curriculum for artists and creatives in a very specific region of the world. And that is in the Canadian and US Arctic. I work at this moment, at least almost exclusively with remote Arctic communities in the Canadian territory of Nunavut, as well as in central Alaska, with a number of tribes that are in and around the region of Fairbanks. What I'm sharing today eventually will also be available on this website that's sort of gradually being developed, and where we're gonna share the curriculum and all the various elements that are part of this program that I'm gonna present to you today. So today I'm gonna talk a little bit about the incubator for digital entrepreneurship in the Arctic. And this is where you can find the information about it. So what is it, the Incubator for Digital Entrepreneurship in the Arctic? It's currently a National Science Foundation funded project. And the ultimate goal for it really is to create a 12-week online and on-site entrepreneurship program for the digital creative economy. So like I said, we work with remote communities in Nunavut, Canada, and as well as with the Tanana Chiefs Conference. The Tanana Chiefs Conference represents 42 interior federally recognized tribes in the state of Alaska in and around a radius of about 3 to 4 hours flight from Fairbanks. So basically about 40% of the entire state is represented by this particular tribal conglomerate. And the idea really is to create an Arctic entrepreneurship ecosystem that specifically focuses on digital creative industries. In Nunavut, Canada, this past summer, we worked with the community of Arviat. Arviat is 61 degrees north. It's directly situated on Hudson Bay, and this is the airport. So we flew into Arviat, Nunavut, in May of 2019 and spent a couple of weeks there with the local community doing a number of workshops. And the Tanana Chiefs Conference, you can see outlined here on this map, so it gives you a bit of a scale of the community that we're talking about here, the communities that we're talking about, so Central Alaska.
Olaf, your slides are not advancing. I don't know if you've been advancing on your end.
They are.
Okay, can you just hit the button swap? There you go. Thanks.
Okay, there it works. Okay, good. So here's the representation of the Tanana Chiefs, and I'm trying to advance my slides on my end, and that's not working. So I don't know what I can do here to. There we go. So in Alaska, we work particularly with the communities of Hughes and Huslia. So these are small communities of the Tanana Chiefs Conference, somewhere between 112 community members in the case of Hughes here, and in the other case of Huslia was about 350 community members. So these are small, remote, fly-in only communities in the state of Alaska, and fairly remotely located. So this is where the pin is dropped on this map here is the actual location of Hughes. So about 2.5 hours west of Fairbanks. So what do we do in these communities to build or co-create a curriculum together that has a goal of developing curriculum and entrepreneurship training really for artists and digital natives? The first thing we did is an entrepreneurship readiness survey, kind of a standardized survey based on work of other entrepreneurship scholars. We had about a sample of about 400 community members throughout the Tanana region and Nunavut that participated. We also did a digital skills survey to assess what kind of particular creative digital skills people have in these communities already, what kind of access to technology they have, what kind of barriers exist to this. And in addition to that, we basically conducted a whole series of week-long community workshops, utilizing technologies of participation, community-guided conversation, and the idea was to identify and ideate, first of all, what kind of particular business needs the communities have, and what kind of business needs exist for the Arctic. Many of these communities have tremendous artistic talent, and that is exactly what we're sort of trying to figure out. What kind of digital artistry in particular, what kind of digital creative skills do exist in these communities, and how can we further develop them by co-designing with them an entrepreneurship curriculum in the future. So the Arctic is surprisingly well digitally connected. This is one of the things that we found out in our specific workshop here. And what the communities are really looking for is culturally specific content that helps them create opportunities for artists and for others in the local communities there to advance entrepreneurial projects. Here's the particular areas that we were specifically asked to develop content for. The first thing was virtual and in-person ecotourism. So virtual ecotourism, just to give you an idea, the main project that we designed and worked on in Arviat was digital virtual drone-guided polar bear tourism. Arviat is one of those communities in Hudson Bay, on the Hudson Bay, that has frequent polar bear visitors to the community, but also out on the ice. And the locals there are equipped and are interested in guiding people and developing digital visual content that basically helps you or allows you to visit polar bears from a safe distance off your desk at home, and your Oculus Rift or other sort of virtual technology that can be utilized to fly over certain parts of the Arctic there. So that's one project we worked on. We also worked with a number of individuals in Alaska on specific photography and videography projects. So sort of capturing the wilderness with drones, and videography with 3D cameras, with 360-degree cameras as we're driving, and as we're also on the rivers in Alaska there, sort of capturing nature basically and visualizing that. We also had lots of conversations with them about developing content for craft industries, so clothing, food, beverages, that they're interested in marketing from these small communities up in the Canadian and US Arctic there. The other thing, that the main takeaway that we sort of had from this initial work in the communities before we're now building the curriculum is that these communities all have a strong need for family and community support structures. Many of the folks that participated in our workshops needed child or elder care while they're participating in it. And they're also interested not necessarily in developing individual businesses, so individually owned sole proprietorships and stuff like that, but many of the communities are interested in generating tribally or cooperatively owned business models. So not your standard LLCs or sole proprietorships, but rather developing businesses that are owned really by the entire community. And the reason for that, as we found out, is that many of these communities, especially when they're small, see a danger in one particular member of their community developing a business that can have a profound impact on the community. There's a fear that if one business is successful and it doesn't quite fit with the community values, that can sort of really turn a community around and its values around. So that's a major danger for working in these communities. So they're opting really for cooperative and tribal business models. So right now we're in the process of building and developing this actual curriculum after this first summer of field work, and it's specifically focused on developing content, really primarily digital, video-based, drone-based, photography-based content to design these kinds of workshops in the communities there. So just to give you an idea of who we're working with, on the left there is my collaborator, Pasch. On the right side, that's me there. And this is one of our small community workshops here in Arviat. Here's some of the participants that we were working with. We work in small groups of about 10 to 12 people, typically in these community workshops. And technology of participation, the technique that we utilize to really sort of generate conversations about entrepreneurship, involved, first of all, working in the classroom and having really sitting back. Us as instructors really focused on letting the community identify their particular issues, their particular interests, their values, their interests in developing arts and creatively based businesses themselves, and trying to sit back as much as possible. In addition to that, we also worked with them on the land. One thing that I've found out really very quickly about working in the Arctic is that people don't like to be inside. They don't like to be confined in the classroom. So any kind of curriculum development, any kind of conversation often has to happen in the field. So this is Billy Ukutak that you can see here dressed up in traditional Inuit garb. And we did a photography workshop, a sort of professional photography workshop with this group of students, with this group of community members out on the ice. So they brought their cameras, we brought our cameras, we introduced them to DSLR and art photography, and then we shot these kinds of pictures with them there. So here's another picture of how this worked. We also did a number of individual interviews with community members. Here's my colleague Tim again, interviewing one of the Inuit youth that was part of our workshop, and sort of asking her about her interests in businesses, her interest in creativity. And then here's another example of the technologies participation workshop here in Hughes, Alaska. So this was held in a local community center there. And again, the community was gathered around the table. They're designing their ideas, they're developing ideas, they're sharing it with us. And Tim and I are really just sort of sitting back there. The other thing that we did was connect these Arctic communities from Canada and the United States. So on the left here, you have one of our collaborators in Arviat in Canada, Eric Anoy. He's a local filmmaker in Canada. He actually came with us to Alaska to lead part of the workshops that we did. So it was very critical for us that as we're working with Indigenous and First Nations, that we bring experts from the First Nations, from the Arctic to the Arctic with us, and have the sort of global exchange between Canada and the United States that is also part of our program. So in a nutshell, this is what I wanted to share.
Great, thanks, Olaf. Comments or questions for Olaf from the audience? Actually, I see, not to call people out, but I see we've Becky from the First Peoples Fund here. And so I don't know if there's any other. So remind us again, when did you actually, so when did the workshops take place?
In May and June 2019.
Okay, and do you have plans for more down the line?
We did. COVID put
right.
a bit of a delay on this. We were going to go again to Alaska this summer and to Arviat later in the summer, but we're waiting right now to find out what the university's policies are on
Right.
resuming travels. We will develop a workshop for the communities in Alaska before the end of the summer, and if we can't deliver it in person, we will do it remotely. So.
Oh, you will? Okay.
Yeah. So the actual curriculum will be piloted, and one way or another, by the end of August for the first time.
Amy, you have a question, your hand up.
I just mostly to say I really appreciate the talk. And Olaf, I think we met a couple of years ago in Duluth. I gave a lecture there, and
You did.
knowing more of your research.
Yeah.
Just because there's space in the conversation, I'm wondering if your work connects at all to Indigenous data sovereignty and some of the work that's being done around property rights over related areas. I thought what you were saying about tribal communities wanting to collectively own things was really interesting. And it syncs up to some conversations in other parts of kind of cultural economics research, like with the Maori people and tribes where medical researchers have come in and extracted information and used it. And I just wondered if you had observations about this larger context of ownership and this sort of like problematic projection of neoliberal or economic ideas of private ownership onto collective enterprise, and kind of if you could just share more what you've been learning in your work.
Sure. So I think the first thing I want to mention is that this is a National Science Foundation project that's sponsored by the Office of Polar Programs. What that means is that it requires that all of our data, everything that we generate, surveys, photography, pictures, drone footage, everything has to be shared. We are required to share with the NSF Arctic Data Center. That's at UCSB in Santa Barbara. And one of their key missions really is data sovereignty for Arctic populations. So the idea is that it's, first of all, publicly shared, but also personalities and individuals are protected. So they have a data sharing, but also a data security protocol in place that was developed in collaboration with Arctic tribes. So there's another NSF project called ELOCA. It's a lengthier acronym that's, I can't remember right now exactly what it stands for, but that particular project also focuses on Indigenous data sovereignty. So this idea that data generated in the Arctic must be shared and owned by the populations in the Arctic. So what we're doing with our curriculum is we're currently developing it in Canvas at the University of Minnesota and University of North Dakota, but eventually we're going to hand over the content to them. So right now we have a protocol in place where we are the main curriculum developers. This goes to the Tanana chiefs and goes to the hamlet of Arviat. They review it, and they're also part of the production process. So for example, some of the videos that we're generating are not recorded by us, but by local entrepreneurs. So we co-develop the content with them and provide guidance, but this is not by no means content that will eventually be owned by us. So
that's so interesting, and I'd love to the acronym, if you don't mind putting it in the chat, if you're able to, and I can follow up with you offline. But there's a whole related conversation about property rights, and some of these are entrepreneurial, but using blockchain to assign investment trusts of property rights to tribal groups, and it seems like it overlaps a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting, the work you're doing. I look forward to learning more.
Yeah, I just changed the link. It's the Exchange for Local Observations and Knowledge of the Arctic.
Thank you. Got it.
Thank you, Olaf. We'll have more time for discussion at the end, but I want to move to our next presentation. So Ben, I'm going to give you ability to share your screen.
Great. Hi. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes. Hi. Hi, Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Olaf and Aparna, for your presentations, and thank you all for being here now. I'm just going to pull up my presentation right here. And can you tell me, can you see the presenter view?
No, we are good. We see a full slide.
Okay, cool. So my name is Ben Toscher. I'm zooming to you now from Trondheim, Norway. Trondheim's in about the middle of Norway, and I'm at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. It's about the biggest university in Norway. I'm part of a research center called Engage, the Center for Engaged Education through Entrepreneurship. And I do research and teach in arts entrepreneurship. And particularly with my research, I'm interested in entrepreneurial learning in the context of arts and music education. Today's presentation is called Blank Canvas, Explorative Behavior, Personal Agency in Arts Entrepreneurship in Higher Music Education. So an overview about what I'll go over. First, I'm going to go over the background of the study, basically what I've been reading and my rationale and reasoning behind this study that I'll be presenting for you, the purpose of the study, what are my questions I'm trying to answer with this work, the methodology, then I'll go into the results and implications, and then finally we can open it up for questions, comments, and discussions. Just a quick warning, I'm going to kind of speed through a lot of this as I go into the results. It's really detailed, which is based upon the methodology that I've used. So if you want to spend more time with something, you can find a draft of this full paper in the papers that have been shared in connection with the symposium in the, I guess it's the box folder that Doug sent a link out to earlier. So if you want to get into something in more detail, it's there within the full paper. So running through it, background of the study. First, entrepreneurial skills and knowledge are important for musicians' careers. This is something that's been explored in many articles in the literature, but particularly these articles right here. Music students have been found to graduate as enforced entrepreneurs because there is not a high level of full-time employment opportunities for them once they graduate. At the same time, alumni of higher music education have reported a gap between the importance of these entrepreneurial skills that they need and their actual acquisition to their education. And so what is the result of this? Institutes of higher music education have integrated arts entrepreneurship education to help music students acquire these entrepreneurial skills and knowledge to a greater extent. Many of you probably already know this, but arts entrepreneurship, I'm considering that the subject of entrepreneurship taught in the context of music in arts educations. An interesting statistic about the subject, in the United States in 2005, there was 37 institutions that were found offering arts entrepreneurship. In 2016, this number had increased to 168 institutions, but it's not just in the United States, it's all over the world. There's courses being reported in Australia, Germany, the UK, and in Norway. And in my particular study, I'm going to be sharing results from my own teaching of arts entrepreneurship here in Norway. In Norway, in 2017, Watney and Nymoon found there are at least 35 courses in higher music education that had entrepreneurship as a stated competency goal, and 49 obligatory courses where entrepreneurship was either a minor or major component. The interesting thing about this, I think, is that the majority of courses in arts entrepreneurship are experiential. And I yet only recently have theories of experiential learning and entrepreneurial learning been introduced into the arts entrepreneurship literature. What I'm going to present to you real quick is a model that I presented into, has been published in Artivate in 2019, that has different components about entrepreneurial learning and experiential learning that I argue are important for arts entrepreneurship educators to consider in order to promote the entrepreneurial knowledge generation of these students. I'm not going to go through the argumentation of why each of these components are interesting. You can find that argumentation in further length in Artivate, in the article I'm referring to here. But of these 5 components, the one I'm exploring in this article is this enabling student agency and encouraging explorative behavior. And I'm going to go into why these 2 aspects, student agency and explorative behavior, are interesting. But first, a couple important definitions and operationalizations for the study. I define, or I'm using the definition of personal agency as the ability to accomplish action, and explorative behavior as choosing new actions that are distinct from what has already been taken. So why is this interesting? Why should we care about this, right? First, it hasn't been studied before. But second, I argue that the concept of explorative behavior is core to this entrepreneurial learning in the context of arts entrepreneurship. It's something also that entrepreneurial learning theories, particularly from Politis, emphasize. Learning from experience is core to experiential learning. And here, new experience is particularly interesting. And then this idea of, okay, well, why don't I talk about exploitation? Why am I talking about exploration? So the difference is exploitative behavior, as I refer to it, basically relates to exploiting old certainties or what is already known, implying that individuals learn from experience by exploiting old certainties. It's thus about creating reliability in experience. The returns are hence more generally certain, closer in time and closer in space than returns to exploration. And this distinction is really important in a lot of the management literature, this difference between exploration and exploitation. And I argue that given the majority of students' career status in higher music education, exploration is more interesting. Here's a quick thought experiment. If you took U2, the band, and you took an unknown prog rock band from Ohio, which one do you think would benefit more from exploration, right? U2 has their audience. They can exploit that audience. They can fill up stadium rock amphitheaters, whereas this unknown, unestablished band, their audience is probably much smaller compared to U2's. So they really need to take explorative actions to kind of achieve some equilibrium in their career. And then there's this idea of uncertainty, which is core to entrepreneurship. And I argue that exploration is a true way to explore this uncertainty. So the purpose of the study, here's my research question. How do students explore and exercise personal agency in arts entrepreneurship education? And here's how I answer that research question. So I have conducted a single case embedded research design based upon a course that I've designed and taught in arts entrepreneurship here in Norway. It was a 5-credit course in entrepreneurship for master's students in music, communication, and technology. The course you could characterize as the being enterprising type of arts entrepreneurship, as opposed to new venture or career transitioning approach. I approach this from a teacher research approach, trying to address real problems in the classroom. The data comes from 9 student participants with a variety of educational and professional backgrounds in music. We did interviews, they kept learning diaries. I analyzed their course deliverables, action logs that they kept. I kept my own research journal, and then we also produced some business model canvases. The main thing they did in this course was work on a project in teams to identify a problem and create a solution that creates some sort of economic, social, or environmental or cultural value for someone. So that was the main context of this course, right? So it's action-based. Students were working on projects. How do I analyze the data? I use the so-called JOIA method, which is a qualitative research method to use analytic rigor to make sense of qualitative data, to build a data structure and model. I won't go into the details here, but basically it involves building up a data structure from the data to increasingly higher levels of abstraction. So moving from first order codes to second order themes to theoretical subcategories into theoretical dimensions. And you'll see what that looks like when I present this model and the results. So the empirical context, as I said, it was this course in entrepreneurship I taught. Entrepreneurship was framed in the broader opportunity recognition and value creation senses of the word. As a lot of people talk about, there's many different definitions of entrepreneurship, especially in music education. But the main thing is students were given a blank canvas, like I said, about which they could iteratively learn about and act upon an opportunity of their choosing. And the idea was that that opportunity had to create some sort of economic, social, cultural, environmental value for themselves and society. And the pedagogy was inspired by design engineering, experiential, andragogical, and action-based learning. All right. Here's a description of all the data that I collected in the data which I analyzed. Again, this isn't the full paper if you really want to dig into the details. But as you can see with data like the student learning diaries and the action logs and the business model canvases, those were collected throughout the 5-week course, as well as the journal. And then I conducted interviews before and after at the end of the course. Here's kind of an overview of this embedded design. The students were in 4 teams. One thing to note is I'm analyzing the individual students. I'm not analyzing data at the team level. I'm analyzing individual students as the unit of analysis. And we'll see how this kind of plays through to the results later. Some quick aspects of study design ethics. I got approval from the Norwegian protection official for research to do the study. Participation in the study was completely voluntary. To reduce some bias, students were informed after the course was completed that they had the opportunity to participate in the study if they would allow their learning diaries to be used. And then students were also given the option to participate after the course was completed, and they got their grades, ensuring them that it was completely voluntary. Whether they said yes, no, it wouldn't affect anything about our relationship or the grade or anything like that. And so based on that, I was able to sample really 9 interesting students who were in the course. So now to the results, and I'm going to run through this a bit quickly, but again, you can dig into the details later. Here was my research question. How do students explore and exercise personal agency in arts, entrepreneurship, education? My answer, within a teacher-created learning environment, students balance personal and social factors to take balanced actions to reduce uncertainty. Here is a model showing how students take balanced actions to reduce uncertainty. They come into the course with existing knowledge, and then they take balanced actions to reduce uncertainty based upon these personal factors and social factors, ultimately resulting in some entrepreneurial knowledge generation. Now I'm going to go through each one of these components and these theoretical dimensions in more depth, but this model right here is based upon this data structure, which comes from all of this data which I've just described through. So I'm just going to walk you through it now. So within a teacher-created learning environment, this is one of the sub-theoretical dimensions. So this teacher-created learning environment consisted of a few things. Here were some themes that came up. It was team-based learning, there was the theoretical content, there was entrepreneurship education, and there was establishing a timeline for deliverables. And as I present this data to you, as we move from left to right, there's going to be first order codes, second order themes, and then the theoretical subcategories. So in terms of the second order codes, like I said, there was team-based learning, theoretical content, entrepreneurship education, and establishing a timeline for deliverables. I think one of the 2 most interesting things of all these codes here, the first is that this is, the theoretical content that I provided them obviously is going to frame this teacher-created learning environment. But then also this experiential entrepreneurship education will, an interesting quote from the students, they liken this to making a boat while rowing. I introduced them to effectuation. They talked about using what's in front of them, but also this establishing a timeline for deliverables in the teacher-created learning environment. This is a factor which influences how they take actions. The personal factors. These personal factors include their values and beliefs, habitual modes of thought, prior experience and personal goals. So in terms of, I'll just highlight habitual modes of thought. I had some students that were really analytical when it came to recognizing opportunities. Other students were very intuitive. And that affected how they took these actions to reduce uncertainty. And then there was also values and beliefs. This idea of Silicon Valley and entrepreneurs came up, and this idea of art having a moral responsibility came up. Moving on real quick here. Social factors, conditions of approval, social interdependencies. These conditions of approval had to do with things like students asking me, the teacher, whether I thought it was a good idea for them to try an action that would involve going out in the world and seeing whether their solution would work. It also had to do with mandatory requirements. I see the red here. Yeah, balanced actions to reduce uncertainty. Flash themes, opportunity recognition, uncertainty, taking action. The main takeaway here, to summarize, I'm reminded of a story. One day a fish is swimming along nicely in the water when another fish approaches. "Hey, how's the water today?" asks the approaching fish, to which the first fish replies, "Water? What's that?" And this is a story from David Foster Wallace. But the point is where teachers are creating the teacher-created learning environment. And so we need to be aware of that, including the conditions of approval we set for them for passing the course, but also how they approach uncertainty. And then finally, this balancing of personal and social factors in the course design will affect student outcomes, and educators can influence this balance. This is something we have control over. And then students also have their own habitual modes of thought, their values and belief coming into the classroom, which kind of supports this more student-centered, idiosyncratic approach to entrepreneurship education. Yeah, that's about it. I know I went through that really quick at the end, but yeah, thanks.
Great, thanks, Ben. Questions or comments for Ben? And I'll start because we'll start with Ben and then we'll just open up the discussion. But so I guess my question is, how much does context matter? Because the way you started this presentation is talking about what the definition of arts entrepreneurship really is. And you gave us a pretty, I think, specific definition, because I don't think everyone would define it like that. You talked about how it's really entrepreneurial education within the context of the arts. So I guess my question is, even when I'm looking at your implications and your conclusions, is that much of these don't seem to I guess a question like, how much does the arts context actually matter here? You gave a good so one of your points was how much arts entrepreneurship education, how many of these programs have proliferated through the United States, all across the world. But you could probably say, you can say the same thing is true for just entrepreneurial education in general. Colleague here, David Aldrich, writes about entrepreneurial education, and he's, it's a booming field, right? So I guess, what's your response? How much does context matter? Yeah,
that's a great question. Really good question. I've been thinking about that. So the first thing is, I think context is definitely influential within the specific context of arts entrepreneurship. We're talking whether it's music or visual arts context. So like that context matters. So for this particular study and this research design, I feel very comfortable about presenting my model and my findings for this context of arts entrepreneurship. However, I think it's a discussion I could have, and I have had with other colleagues who teach in the broader context of arts entrepreneurship, that they recognize some of these things that I found, right? These conditions of approval, or these kind of how students go about reducing uncertainty. I don't know if I could take what I found and take it to like a more broader entrepreneurship education journal, like Entrepreneurship Education and Pedagogy, and see what they think about it. That really wasn't my point, but or the kind of the goal with the research design. But just to add on to that, with this personal these personal factors, values, and beliefs. In my experience here in Norway, I'm also involved in a master's degree in technology-based entrepreneurship with new venture creation. And a lot of these discussions that we experienced in the arts entrepreneurship context about the moral responsibility of entrepreneurs, and it's kind of these other, socioeconomic or moral ethical dimensions, that doesn't come up as often in the new venture creation master's in technology-based entrepreneurship. So there could kind of just be some adaptability of that factor. But I think confluence is, context is important, as you're bringing up.
Yeah.
That answers your question.
No, absolutely. And I think it's you being in Norway too and conducting this study is also right. It's a different. So I guess I also had the question of, so my friends over here in the Jacobs School of Music, there's an arts entrepreneurship program, and I think they're possibly the means are similar to what you described, but the end of what they're trying to achieve is a little bit different for their graduates. And so I wonder how much that the difference in outcomes and the goals of what these programs are trying to achieve, that they're influenced by the means that they take to get there. So anyway, I just kept on thinking, yeah.
I think that's a great point. So like I said, this was a being enterprising type of arts entrepreneurship. And part of that is because I was brought on board, they had established a degree program and they had their goals with their learning outcomes, and that fits best. But if this was like a career transitioning type of arts entrepreneurship, really focusing on getting students to build up their portfolio or go out there and take some of these first steps in the career, we might find a very different result to reduce that.
Right. Yeah. And I was thinking about that. And that's generally, I mean, here in the United States, I think a lot of our cultural entrepreneurship programs tend to be focused on that latter outcome there. So Aparna, you have your hand up. You want to ask Ben a question?
So a couple of things. I think this is very interesting in what you found through a deep qualitative study. I like that part of it, that you've really gone into detailed understanding of how students saw this and how you sort of looked at their notes on a day-to-day basis, what was going on. So that's very rich. The question I have is what you came up with in terms of personal factors and social factors. There is a lot in generic entrepreneurship literature that talks about the sort of social factors and personal factors. They don't use exactly the same terms, but in the entrepreneurial sort of attitudes, intentions, and motivations theory literature, there is a lot of discussion about that. And I'm wondering and we didn't get a chance to look at details as to what you found in those specifically, but how does that tie to what is kind of, known in the generic entrepreneurship literature? What are some similarities and what are some unique things that you found in the context of, music particularly, or, this domain?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess the first thing I should say, the methodology I've used is largely inductive. So in terms of when I'm looking at the data, I'm not really getting to the entrepreneurial intentions or attitudes literature to code my first data as I find it. My familiarity with like the entrepreneurship education outcomes and measures literature, you're talking about intentions and attitudes and stuff. I've only kind of read some like meta-analysis studies, kind of looking at a lot of the data is really inconclusive as to what the effects and impacts of broader entrepreneurship education is. So so that being said, I haven't really gone into the metrics and models and what comprise those constructs, but that's a really good idea to look into the future and to go back into my data and kind of look at it within that light. I'm interested in exploring what else might be there.
Because I suspect, you'll find something that is so unique to the context as you do that kind of analysis.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. I also think it's good for discussing the results. What I've found. I think it's also to be mindful based upon this design and the method of the Joy method is not kind of really constraining my data to what a literature already says. But I think in terms of like integrating existing knowledge, it's a great point.
We can open up the discussion now to anything that brings in other papers, a synthesis of the 3 papers, whatever anyone wants to discuss. But I just want to add on that point that Aparna talked about. I mean, I also see that I read your paper a lot earlier on, so I don't know at this point where it is, what stage it is in the process of revisions. But I remember thinking to myself that you could really tap into a broader literature on entrepreneurial education overall, and and not necessarily use that as a framework, but I guarantee you that not only in what your conclusions, I'm sure your conclusions will be aligned with points made in that literature, but you also will find, and this goes back to my context question, you're also likely going to find some anomalies and some differences based on the context in which you're working, which I think is actually really valuable. No.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So it's gone through revisions and it has gone through review. And I had a very helpful reviewer that referred me to some other work by Kolb and Kolb, who I'm using here, who have looked into that. So they looked at the context of arts education and management education and kind of relating that to, in terms of, kind of related to this, at least in terms of this habitual modes of thought and how the context of an education might influence these personal factors of, like there's a great example from that Kolb and Kolb article. There's someone they were going to go do a seminar in experiential learning in the arts context. And then they said, well, what text should we send them? And the arts person said, no, our students don't really learn through text. And this was like a fundamental contrast between the context of arts and the management education, right? So how they sense make, if you will.
So I have a question for the panelists, for all three of you. I mean, all of you presented work that was looking at, in a sense, entrepreneurial learning methodologies, right, across different subpopulations. And so I'm wondering, just from watching each other's presentations, what were some of those commonalities that maybe popped out at you that you also observed in the population that you study, and possibly what are those extreme differences that just wouldn't apply? Just maybe, Aparna, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I'm listening to Ben, and you're talking about, you use the terms like, teacher-directed environments, right? And when we look at self-directed learning happens in both teacher-directed environments as well as formal environments, as well as informal environments. So it's fascinating to see the sort of, intersection coming there in terms of, because self-directed learning can happen even, in academic settings where teachers actually are focusing more on getting students to be self-directed versus and create those environments for them. So in terms of, I would love to then, I haven't read your paper, so I would love to go and read your paper to see how that kind of maps on in terms of a lot of what you're doing in terms of creating the environment for entrepreneurship education over there. Maybe there are some strong elements of, self-directed learning and discovery that are coming in what you're saying. So I see that kind of intersection fascinating for further exploration there, at least for my interest.
Yeah. Olaf, did you see anything?
Well, I think what we all share is that sort of interest in self-directed learning and modes of learning, but I feel a little bit like an outlier, because a lot of the work that I had to do, or did in the Arctic, was much less classroom based than I had originally anticipated. When we started out working with the hamlet of Arviat and with the Tanana Chiefs, the idea was to just do classroom-based learning and to sort of work through similar, a learning environment as close as possible to a university classroom. Let's say it this way. We had to scrap those plans as those conversations gradually sort of unfolded, and it became much more clear that the self-directed learning and exploration outside in the field through sort of alternative modes of exploration was something that was essential, for working with the populations that we're working with. Mm-hmm. So even designing the curriculum right now, that's sort of at the heart of that. A lot of the exercises that we're going to be working with are based on doing work outside. So they're not quote unquote classroom work per se, but they involve the sort of the direct exploration outside of the outdoors. So the sort of cultural adaptation is one key thing that sort of sticks out to me here, that I wanted to highlight again. The other thing that I wanted to bring up, and that wasn't sort of part of Ben's and Aparna's presentation, really is the significance of language in working with certain kinds of populations. I didn't really highlight this too much as I was talking, but we very quickly learned how important it is to use certain words of the entrepreneurship lingo and how to avoid certain kinds of words. And I think that's something that I would really like to explore with other people and sort of have a broader conversation about. So, a lot of entrepreneurship curriculum, for example, utilizes terms such as like pain or painkiller, solving or even problem solving. That very idea of problem solving was regarded by especially the indigenous First Nations in Canada as reminding them of the RCMP coming to their door, seeing if there's any problem that needs to be resolved here. So I just wanted to bring that up as sort of an additional element, I think, that across our work may be significant.
Yeah, agreed. I actually noticed this sort of continuum of what we now call professionalization across all three of your presentations, right? So we've moved largely into the classroom for so many of the ways that we go through professional development in general. And however, it's, there's still so many debates, even just within the teaching and learning literature, about whether or not that's the best place to be. And I feel like, especially among very, very young children, we seem to be reverting backwards to, okay, the classroom actually isn't the greatest place to learn. We're going to do nature-based preschool programs or something like that. So I saw this degree of sort of professionalization and context again that really mattered. Ben, any final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting. I mean, the obvious thing we all share is you both are in Minnesota. I'm assuming, Olaf, you're in Minnesota. And we're high up here latitude-wise, so all three of us presenters and Aparna too. But I think it's this idea of self-direction and kind of moving outside of the classroom walls is a common theme and is very interesting. And Olaf, you had mentioned something really interesting, and I had a particular student when it came to problem solving that kind of they also had an interesting response to it, and it was this response of, well, I don't live my life going out looking for problems to solve. So this whole idea that you're asking us to go out and find problems to solve, it's kind of weird. It's kind of disharmonious with who they are and their philosophy. So it's it might not be the same meaning and context that with you've related with your students, but I think it is interesting when we're introducing these concepts that we've got with us to people to be mindful of, even though we might be very familiar with it, their interpretations completely.
For sure.
Yeah, I think that problem-solving notion I've heard with my students too. And I think it seems that, certainly those who are coming from the arts and background, when they think of arts, they're not necessarily thinking about problem-solving. When it comes to creativity, it's not in the context of problem-solving. It's in the context of, creation and, realization of the art form that they're practicing. But if you look at business students and business students who are from the business school, they absolutely think about problem solving. So when we bring all the management literature into this and use those terms, I can see how that creates, challenges in students' mind who are not exposed to the other side of it and really are looking at it from an art perspective. I think that's a great point. Yeah.
Well, you guys just gave me a really good idea for another study that I'm working on right now. So thank you. So I benefited from this panel. Just round of applause for everybody. Thank you so much to all the presenters.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed hearing your presentations.